Welcome back to More Music Por Favor presents The Stories Streaming Can't Tell. I'm your host, Marcus Reed, and this is the place for more music and the stories behind it. Today we're diving into the cursed album that ruined 5 careers. 5 people, 1 record. Every single one of them watched their life fall apart after touching it. The producer, dead within 2 years. Circumstances that still don't add up. The lead singer, a 2-year addiction spiral that cost him his voice, his label deal, his band. The label president who bankrolled the whole thing. Bankruptcy, public, humiliating, total. The recording engineer, a breakdown so severe he left the industry and never came back. And the photographer who shot the cover art? A tragic accident that ended his career before the album even hit shelves. 5 careers, 1 album, and a legend that grew in the dark, because the music industry tried hard to bury this story. So here's the question I've been chasing. Is this a curse? Is it coincidence? Or is it something more human and more sinister than either of those? Let's get into it. Before I tell you what happened to these 5 people, I want you to picture the room where it all began. A recording studio, mid-decade, mid-90s. The kind of room that still smelled like cigarettes because smoking was still technically allowed, as long as it was the producer doing it. 3 in the morning. The band has been recording for 9 hours. The producer, a man who has made records with people who sell out arenas, is sitting with his headphones off, listening to a playback with the rest of them. No one is talking. When it finishes, the producer looks at the lead singer and says quietly, "That's going to ruin us." He meant it as a compliment. The album they were making existed at the worst possible intersection. The mid-1990s, when major labels had just discovered that authentic could sell, really sell, and were pouring budgets into finding the next dangerous voice they could package. The contradiction built into that sentence is obvious in hindsight. But in 1994, 1995, a lot of artists genuinely believed they could have it both ways. Artistic integrity, commercial reach. This band believed it harder than most. I'm not going to name them, and I want to be clear, that's not caution talking. I know more about this story than I'm going to say today. Some of the people involved are still living with it, and some of them are still in this industry. What I can tell you is that if you know your 1990s underground rock history, you already know the shape of this story. You've seen versions of it. Hüsker Dü, one of the most important bands of their generation, watched their label relationship quietly implode under the weight of internal chaos and industry pressure that never fully made it into the official narrative. Jawbreaker signed to a major, made a record of brutal honesty, and got punished commercially for exactly that honesty, in ways that took years to fully understand. Babes in Toyland fought battles with their label that only came into focus long after the damage was done. Those stories are documented. Those names are public. The story I'm telling you today is different, closer to the bone, and not yet ready for the public record. But if you understand what happened to those bands, you understand the terrain. You know what the industry is capable of when it decides a record isn't worth protecting. The legal filings in this case are real. The press archives are real. The interviews exist. This happened. The band had 2 albums out, critically praised, neither commercial, but there was an underground hunger around them, a loyalty that felt almost devotional, and the label thought the right producer and the right budget could convert that devotion into something massive. They were almost right. Almost. The label brought in a producer, a genuine visionary, someone who had worked with major artists and understood both the commercial game and the experimental edge. He and the band immediately clashed. He pushed them toward longer songs, stranger structures, lyrics that didn't resolve cleanly. The band pushed back, and then, in the recording sessions, something shifted. The producer stopped fighting them. He started following them somewhere he hadn't planned to go. What came out of those sessions was 70 minutes of music that felt, sonically, like you were standing very close to something that was trying not to collapse. The guitar tones were huge, and then suddenly absent. The rhythm section created this low-level anxiety that never quite resolved. Not the kind of tension that releases into a chorus, but the kind that just stays in your chest. And underneath all of it, the singer's voice, a raw instrument being pushed to its absolute edge. The lyrics dealt with addiction, paranoia, spiritual collapse, industry exploitation, not as metaphor, as testimony. Insiders who heard early cuts described it the same way. It felt like a confession. And that's where the first warning sign appeared, before the album was even released. The label president, after hearing the final mix, tried to shelve it. He wanted to re-record 4 tracks with a more commercial approach. The band refused. The producer, whose relationship with the label had become complicated, sided with the band. The standoff lasted 3 months. Meanwhile, the photographer who'd shot the cover art, a surrealist image that the label also objected to, was in a car accident. Minor injuries, but it shook people. The timing felt wrong. When the album finally came out, the label gave it almost no promotional support. No radio push, minimal press. The reviews that came in were divided. Some critics called it the most important rock record of the year. The commercial response was silence. And then, one by one, things started falling apart. Let's talk about each of the 5, because this is where the story gets human, and that's where it gets genuinely unsettling. And I'll say this, if any part of what you're about to hear sounds familiar, if it rhymes with something you've read about a band you love, that's not a coincidence. That's just how the industry worked. The lead singer was already struggling before recording began. The album's lyrics were personal, uncomfortably personal, because he was writing from inside an addiction he hadn't fully admitted to himself. Recording brought it into the open. The sessions, by multiple accounts, were sometimes transcendent and sometimes terrifying. When the album didn't sell, the bottom fell out. Without the structure of a promotional cycle to hold him together, he spiraled. 2 years of very public collapse. He eventually got sober, and that part of the story deserves to be said. But his relationship with the band never recovered, and the label had already moved on. The producer died 22 months after the album's release. The official cause was a cardiac event. He was 41. People who knew him said he'd been under extraordinary financial stress. He'd invested heavily in a studio project that was tied to the album's success. When the album failed commercially, the studio deal fell apart. He was working 3 projects simultaneously to recover the losses. The stress killed him. Is that a curse? Or is that what happens when a creative person's financial survival gets tied to a record the industry decided to punish? The label president's bankruptcy is the part of the story that has the most paper trail. Court documents from 1997 and 1998 show a label that had overextended itself on several projects simultaneously, this album among them. But in internal communications that surfaced years later, the album is specifically cited as the investment that broke the label's momentum with distributors. When one flagship release fails badly enough, the whole house of cards can come down. He lost the label, lost his house, started over in a completely different industry. The recording engineer's breakdown came 18 months after release. He'd been the one in the room the most, through every session, every argument, every 3 a.m. revelation the band had. He later described those sessions as the most intense working environment he'd ever experienced, like being inside someone else's nervous system. After the album, he couldn't re-engage with standard commercial work. Everything felt shallow. He took a leave of absence. The leave became permanent. The industry lost him completely. The photographer's story is the one that people remember most vividly, maybe because it happened first. The cover photo he'd taken was this extraordinary image, layered, slightly disturbing, the kind of image that makes you feel something before you understand why. After the accident, he developed a tremor. Not severe, he could still work, but precision photography was no longer possible for him at the level he'd been operating at. He transitioned into other work. He's never spoken publicly about the album. Now, and this is where I want you to think carefully with me, the music itself. Because here's what the legend always skips over. The album is extraordinary. The people who find it, and it's findable if you know where to look, consistently describe it as one of the most emotionally demanding listening experiences they've ever had. Not in a pretentious way, in a way that feels like the record is reading you while you're listening to it. The lyrics name things that weren't being named in mainstream rock at that moment. Industry exploitation, specifically. The transactional nature of creative relationships. The way the machine requires you to perform your own authenticity for people who have a financial interest in packaging it. Was the album too experimental? Maybe. Was it too long? Probably. But there's a third possibility that some music historians have raised, and I think it's the most important one. Was it too honest? Did it name things specifically enough that powerful people in the industry had reason to want it to fail? Let me walk you through the exact moment the Cascade started. Because it wasn't dramatic. It was a phone call. The label president called his head of radio promotion. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes. At the end of it, the album got moved from priority push to soft support, industry language for, "We're not spending money on this." That single reclassification rippled out in ways the label president may not have even fully intended. Radio programmers got a different pitch deck. They read the signal. The distributor's sales rep stopped leading with the album in store visits. Music press, which follows label energy as much as it follows music, gave the record polite reviews and moved on. The record became, before most people outside the industry had heard a single note, already marked. The producer's studio investment was contingent on the album performing. It didn't perform. The deal unwound. He took on 3 simultaneous projects to recover. The stress load killed him at 41. The singer's promotional cycle, the thing that would have given his days structure while he was fighting the addiction the album had pulled to the surface, never materialized. The label moved on. The structure disappeared. He spiraled. The label president, managing the fallout from multiple failed pushes at once, watched his distribution relationships erode one by one. The bankruptcy filing came 26 months after the album's release. One phone call, one reclassification, and then, person by person, the same catastrophe. Was it a curse? The word starts to feel almost quaint when you look at the actual mechanism. The curse had a name: the withdrawal of institutional support in an industry where institutional support is oxygen. Hüsker Dü knew that oxygen. Jawbreaker knew it. Babes in Toyland knew it. The band at the center of this story knew it too. They just knew it more completely and more finally than most. The curse framing is compelling. I understand why it grew. When you look at those 5 lives and see the wreckage, the human mind reaches for a supernatural explanation. Because the alternative, that a small number of industry decisions can destroy multiple people's lives is somehow harder to sit with. But that's the story. The music wasn't haunted. The music was honest. And honesty in the commercial music industry of the 1990s could be genuinely dangerous. The bands I mentioned, Hüsker Dü, Jawbreaker, Babes in Toyland, their stories eventually got told. Books, documentaries, anniversary reissues, the kind of retrospective justice the music press is good at delivering. 20 years too late. The band at the center of this episode hasn't had that moment yet. Maybe they will. Maybe the people involved will decide the time is right. Until then, the record exists, the legend exists, and the people who found it know what they found. Why does this matter today? Because the dynamics that destroyed these 5 people haven't disappeared. They've just changed shape. The industry still reads signals about which records it's supposed to champion. Streaming algorithms can bury a record as effectively as a withdrawn promotional budget. Artists still tie their financial and emotional stability to outcomes they don't control. And some music still feels haunted, not because of supernatural forces, but because of what was poured into it. The records that scare people a little, that feel like too much, that name things too specifically, those are usually the records made by people who had the most to lose. The album we talked about today? Still out there, still finding listeners decades later, the way genuinely honest art tends to do. Slowly, quietly, without promotional support, just person to person. Somebody saying, "You have to hear this." That's not a curse. That's something closer to survival. And if you're listening to this right now, there's a version of that album, whatever it is for you, that found you the same way. Because honest music doesn't die. It just waits. Before we go, we put together a Spotify playlist for this episode. It's called Honest Music Doesn't Die, and you'll find the link in the episode description. It starts with the bands we talked about today, Hüsker Dü, Jawbreaker, Babes in Toyland. The records that lived the version of this story I couldn't fully tell you. And it ends with last week's Por Favor Fridays. I'll let you draw your own connections, because they're there. Speaking of which, we dropped 4 tracks on March 13th, and every one of them is on that playlist. Alt-Rock Rebellion released Still Bent, Still Blue. Post-Punk Revival, Post-Breakup Object Grief. The irrational logic of holding on to wreckage as a form of hope.
Why'd you leave your umbrella? You took everything else, all the plans, all the records, and you're doubting yourself. Sky looks clear.
If the album we described today had a sonic sibling on our label, this might be it. Pop Pulse Wave dropped Terrified is just another word for ready. Cinematic electropop about that liminal space between wanting something and surrendering to it. The kind of song that names the feeling before you have the words for it. Retro Psyche Beats released Between the Static and the Love, psychedelic dissociative rock that doesn't just describe the feeling of being a stranger to yourself, it recreates it in sound. Phaser guitars, reverb bloom, extraordinary production. and worldview warriors dropped before the static. Introspective indie hip-hop written for the teenager sitting in the middle of other people's certainties, trying to follow their own thread. Sparse, vinyl crackle production. Half-whispered outro. One of the most quietly powerful things we've released.
None of them agree. How do you hear anything real through all this static? I've sat in rooms where people said the universe runs itself, matter all the way down, no shelf for anything else.
You'll find all of these on our YouTube channel or at moremusicporfavor.com/artists-albums. Go listen. That's the story behind the cursed album that ruined 5 careers. If you love this, hit subscribe to More Music Por Favor for fresh tracks every Friday and new episodes of More Music Por Favor Presents every week. Drop a comment. Have you ever heard a record that felt genuinely haunted? And if so, what was it about the music that made you feel that way? Next week, we're going somewhere completely different. She was a grocery store cashier scanning barcodes by day and writing the English hooks behind K-pop's biggest global hits by night. You've heard her melodies. You've never heard her name. That story next week. Gracias y hasta la próxima.